I was working at a door factory. It was literally like a facility that would make and ship out doors and gates to different places. And it was a nice place run by nice people, and I was happy to have a job. This was just coming off of grad school, and it was like the first Craigslist job I could find, but it wasn't what I wanted to be doing necessarily. And so I would come in and be cataloging hinges and different door parts all day, and just one day walked in and found myself being like, God, if there was a way to just not experience the next 8 hours and just pawn that off somehow and have it immediately be 5 p.m. and I'm going home, like I would do that. Like, God, I would do that every day. And so all of that informed the story and sort of the theme of how we're such different people depending on where we work, and when we walk in there and we're doing what we think is expected of us.
Dan Erickson was an unknown writer with no produced work when he submitted a sample of Severance to Ben Stiller's production company, hoping to pitch the concept for the show. By a stroke of luck, Stiller himself read the sample and was immediately intrigued by the idea.
I loved this script. When I read it, it came into our production company. The writing was so unique, and it just, for me, just jumped out as a tone that I hadn't really seen before, but was both weird and funny and a little bit disconcerting. And it was just Dan Erickson's writing. And and then we started to develop it over the course of a number of years.
With Stiller on board, they pitched the show to various platforms. Ultimately, it was Apple TV, just venturing into the streaming landscape in 2020, that decided to take a chance on Severance.
You just told me the 3-sentence pitch of what Severance is. I remember just thinking about it. Yeah. It was just such a good idea. I remember being like, do you think they're two different people? And you're like, no, it's the same guy, but different. And so I thought, yeah, it should just be two different parts of a person. And so kind of went from there, and yeah. The differences are subtle, but they're there.
Mark, the protagonist of Severance, takes on a job at a company called Lumon, where he voluntarily agrees to undergo a procedure that splits his consciousness. At work, he has no memory of who he is or what he does outside of work. And outside of work, he has no idea of what happens at Lumon or who his co-workers truly are. It's a life divided between two halves, and the tension between these two halves is at the heart of the show. But how do you make a boring, windowless office space look interesting on screen? This show somehow manages to do exactly that. And it's all thanks to cinematographer Jessica Gagné, production designer Jeremy Hindle, and the rest of the crew. When Jessica was approached with this project, she was very hesitant and almost didn't take the job. I mean, let's be honest, a plain white office isn't the most exciting location for any DP. It's actually more of a creative prison. And if you know Jessica's work, you know she thrives on texture and contrast, the complete opposite of what this environment offered. In 2017, a film called Sweet Virginia caught Ben Stiller's attention. The movie was dark, not just in tone, but in its use of contrast. Ben found Jessica's work to be evocative, measured, and organic to the story. He reached out and they began to work together on Escape at Dannemora, a TV miniseries that Stiller was set to direct 7 episodes for. It would be Gagné's first project in the US, having done most of her work in Canada. Later, when the Severance project came across Stiller's desk, there was only one person he wanted to capture what he envisioned.
I feel like Jessica and I have, different cultural reference points. I think the way that I reacted to the script is very different than the way she did, probably because of my sort of, ideas about the genre bending that I think was happening with what Dan was doing. That's what I love about working with Jessica, is that we're usually coming at something from very different points of view, but yet we also kind of like the same things aesthetically, but we're coming from very different places. So there's always a discussion that happens, and that makes it better because we're both kind of having to advocate for what we think.
Jessica recalls her first conversation with Ben about Severance revolving around one central challenge: how to make an office visually interesting. The thought of being confined to a white box with harsh overhead lighting initially concerned her.
I wanted to work with Ben again. You know, we did Escape together and it was a great creative partnership, but because it's an office and it's all top lit and there's no windows, and I love being able to change lighting setups and do things differently. I never light something the same way. So this was my worst nightmare.
What's for dinner?
We warned you.
About the greeting? You were kidding.
We hate it. How many reasons did we come up with?
8.
Good morning. Hi, Mr. Milchek.
What happened?
We'd love to tell you, but unfortunately non-disclosure policy forbids.
To tackle this, she and Ben began gathering inspiration, curating a collection of striking office designs, many of them rooted in the aesthetics of the 1960s. This process was transformative. Jessica found inspiration in the muted, almost surreal office spaces captured by Lars Thunberg and the industrial interiors documented in a photo book by Lynn Cohen. Their work highlighted the awkwardness and monotony of corporate life, a theme that Severance leans into heavily. The production team took their vision further, seeking out real-world locations that embodied this uncanny corporate feel. They landed on places like the Bell Labs building with its circular designs and vast negative spaces. What's really remarkable is how Jessica, along with production designer Jeremy Hindle, took these constraints and turned them into opportunities. Hindle was responsible for designing the sets of Lumon Industries, including those endless white hallways. Most of the sets were practical, built wall to wall within a studio. This 360-degree immersive environment heightened the feeling of disorientation and constant surveillance that defines the series.
There are so many hallways, it's insane. Like Ben wanted to do like a 2-minute walk, and it's basically every set was designed, like we designed every set and how much stage space we had, and we built hallways. It's like a maze all the way around and around and around and around. And the key is that when you first come off this narrow elevator into this little lobby area, the first hallways are like a certain width, and then they get a little bit wider. As you progress, they get wider, so that when you get to the crossroads, that it feels wider, that you're like, okay, now where do I go? Because in Dan's head, the writer, this goes for miles underground, like miles, you know. So for the seasons ahead, it's like a city underground. There's so much going on.
What could have been flat and lifeless was instead transformed into something rich with tension, mystery, and depth, mirroring the show's core themes of isolation and duality. Speaking of duality, Jessica had an interesting approach to visually distinguish and enhance both sides of Mark's life. While looking for camera packages for another project at a rental house, Jessica was recommended the then new Sony Venice, which then became her camera of choice for Severance. The decision wasn't just about the camera's technical specs, but how it could serve the story.
We went with the Sony Venice because I think it's, first of all, one of the cameras that handles contrast the best. The way it handles highlights and HDR is amazing. Because Ben does like contrast a lot, so I definitely we had to crank it in post, and it can be a little scary because we're like riding super high in the highlights. Also, we're shooting vintage lenses from Panavision C-Series. Texture for me is extremely important, and texture comes from the lenses mostly. The fact that we had the C-Series mostly, it kind of just gave us that middle ground, you know?
Inside of the office, the lighting relies heavily on overhead sky panel fixtures. Gagné and the crew designed a ceiling grid to evenly light the space. Now, they wanted to keep focus on the faces of the actors, but also show us the dull and repetitive nature of the environment. Outside of Lumon, longer lenses were used to mirror Mark's sense of isolation. They also had more space to light and lit those scenes with a more dynamic approach. A mix of HMI lights, space lights, and sky panels were used to create a more natural look. So we talked about some of the themes of the show, at least season 1, and I think it's obvious to everyone. Severance is a look at identity, control, and the strange world of modern work. By imagining a life where your personal and work selves are completely separate, it asks big questions about who we are and what we give up in the name of our jobs. What makes Severance powerful is how everything about the show looks and feels connected to those big ideas. The office spaces, the endless hallways, it all feels cold and lifeless, and sometimes that's routine corporate work. When the story shifts outside, the world feels more open and real, like there's a spark of something that Mark's missing. The contrast between these two worlds help us feel the tension that the characters are going through every day. Severance isn't just about Mark's journey, but about all of us, and it makes you think about how much of yourself you give to your job and if that's worth it. My name's Moses. I hope you like this video. Remember, stay a student of the game, and I'm gonna leave you guys with a quote that stuck out to me from this amazing show. Thanks again for watching.